to start today's class by going over one of the most seminal works in the field of hypertrophy science, if not the most, and that is the 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy and muscle growth as put forth by Dr. Brad Schoenfeld in his study called The Mechanisms of Muscle Hypertrophy and Their Application to Resistance Training. In this systematic review and meta-analysis of the scientific literature on hypertrophy, Dr. Schoenfeld found that there are 3 main mechanisms of hypertrophy and muscle growth, which are listed in order of significance or importance. And they are 1. Mechanical tension, 2. Muscle damage, and 3. Metabolic stress. So the first one, mechanical tension, causes the most hypertrophy, and that's what we're going to talk about first. Mechanical tension is caused by loading weight or resistance onto the muscle, which then must produce force and control that force to move, hold, or release the load. And each of those things are a separate muscular mechanism. Now, this mechanical tension caused by the muscle working is the primary cause of hypertrophy, which is probably why it comes first. Any kind of force production produces tension, which is hypertrophic, even if it is an isometric hold or an eccentric reduction of force and release of the load. Stretching is also no exception because it causes tension. So this mechanical tension can be caused by any level of loading or resistance as long as it is controlled and maintained for the number of reps that will take you close to failure. So this is one of the keys to hypertrophy here. Any level of tension quality caused by any level of loading or resistance and needing any amount of force production can all be equally hypertrophic if the work you are doing with it is done close to failure. So it doesn't matter if you're using a really heavy load and only doing 5 reps or a really light load and only doing 25 reps. If you only have a couple reps left in the tank when you are done, you have caused about equal amount of hypertrophy. There might be some differences in the amount which would be due to the different types of hypertrophy being caused, since the heavy load will cause more myofibrillar and the light load will cause more sarcoplasmic. But the point is that all rep ranges and their corresponding loads are equally hypertrophic when taken close to failure. And so generally speaking, most of the time in your hypertrophy training, the amount of reps in reserve that you want to keep in the tank in order to be optimal for hypertrophy is about 1 to 3. Any more, and that will be too taxing and fatiguing for it to be sustainably hypertrophic, and any less, and it will be not doing enough work to be hypertrophic. So as I said, mechanical tension causes the most hypertrophy, and what causes the second most is muscle damage. You learned about this in the last class, of course. Everyone who does hypertrophy training knows that we build muscle by causing muscle damage. That's because the work done by the muscle causes damage to the muscle tissue, either from mechanical or chemical stress. And from the mechanical standpoint, what happens that I talked about in the last class is that actin and myosin are ripped apart in the sarcomeres. And what happens from the chemical standpoint is free radicals are formed called reactive oxygen species, or ROS. And they are formed because of the greater amount of oxygen use that is taking place in the body when you are doing exercise, especially in high rep sets, which are aerobic. So this causes chemical stress, which probably causes more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, whereas the micro tears to the muscle fibers when the sarcomeres are being ripped apart would cause more myofibrillar hypertrophy. So that is the actual mechanics of muscle damage and how it works. And then the third mechanic of hypertrophy is metabolic stress. This is, as you probably know, what happens when you are doing a lot of reps and feeling as though you're getting a really massive pump and feeling a pretty intense lactic acid burn. Alright, and this causes more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy than myofibrillar because this is when the muscle cell swelling causes an increase in protein synthesis and a simultaneous decrease in protein breakdown. So this is an ideal effect for muscle building. And this is probably why lower loads with higher reps at similar proximity to failure are equally hypertrophic as heavy loads. Okay, as I said before, they are both equally hypertrophic, but metabolic stress causes a bit more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, whereas mechanical tension, number 1, causes more myofibrillar hypertrophy. And while these 3 are listed in the order of significance, interestingly enough, it is numbers 1 and 3, mechanical tension and metabolic stress, that cause number 2, muscle damage, which then brings about the anabolic response of hypertrophy and the repair of the muscles. So make sure that you have made note of these 3 mechanisms of muscle growth because they are very important principles for you to remember if you are trying to understand the science of hypertrophy.